Sold for $2. The auctioneer's gavel cracked like a gunshot, and every man in that saloon turned to stare at Callum Hayes like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. He had exactly $2 left to his name, a ranch bleeding money, and no business bidding on anything, let alone a woman nobody else wanted. But there she stood on that platform, thin and still and completely alone, and something in the way she refused to look broken made him step forward before his brain could stop him. He'd never once regretted it. If this story moves, you hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far $2 can travel. The auction had been going on for the better part of 2 hours, and Callum Hayes had stood against the back wall the entire time, hat in hand, watching men he'd known his whole life turn into something he didn't recognize. It wasn't the whiskey, it wasn't the late hour. It was something uglier than both of those things, a kind of permission that a crowd gives itself when nobody steps forward to say stop. 7 women had already been claimed. 7 women who'd answered advertisements in Eastern newspapers, who'd packed everything they owned into a single trunk and ridden 3 days on a rattling stage to reach Harrow Flats, Montana, believing they were coming to meet a husband, not to stand on a platform, while men hollered prices over their heads like they were saddle horses at a county fair. Callum had told himself he was only there to pick up a crate of fence wire the general store was holding. He'd told himself he'd stay 10 minutes, maybe less. He had $23 to his name and a ranch that was bleeding money faster than a stuck calf, and he had no business being anywhere near a situation like this. But he hadn't left. He'd stayed, and now he understood why. Because there was still one woman on that platform. She stood at the far end of the rough-hewn stage, slightly apart from where the auctioneer paced, and gestured and mopped his red face with a handkerchief. She was thin, not in the way of someone who'd chosen it, but in the way of someone who'd been through something long and hard and hadn't come out the other side yet. Her dress was clean, but patched at both elbows, and her dark hair was pinned up with the kind of careful precision that told Callum she'd taken time with it, that she'd wanted to look right, that she'd still been hoping when she stepped off that stage. She wasn't hoping now. Her eyes were down. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and she was very still, the kind of still that isn't peace, but armor. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Dooley, who smelled like bay rum and bad decisions, spread his arms wide and grinned at the crowd. Last one, gentlemen. Miss Era Wynn lately of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Educated woman, they tell me. Good with numbers. He paused, letting the crowd's laughter ride out. Course I don't know what good numbers do ya on a cattle ranch, but maybe she can count your losses for ya. More laughter. Callum's jaw tightened. Who'll open at 20? Silence. 15 then. A man near the bar, Hector Pruitt, who'd buried 2 wives and showed no particular grief about either of them, called out, I'll give you 5. And that's generous, Dooley, considering. Considering what? Someone shouted. Considering she looks like she'd blow away in a strong wind. The room erupted. Callum watched Ara Wynn's shoulders pull in just slightly, a movement so small most men wouldn't have caught it. He caught it. 5, I'm bid, Dooley said. Do I hear 7? Nothing. 6? Nothing. Dooley's showman's smile flickered. He glanced at the woman on the platform with something that might have been pity if he'd been capable of it, and then he cleared his throat. All right, gentlemen, $5. Going once. 2. Callum didn't plan to say it. He would think about that for a long time afterward, how the word came out of him before his mind had finished the argument. $2. It was all he had left after the fence wire. He'd counted it walking over a dollar coin and 4 quarters sitting in his breast pocket, like a prayer he hadn't decided to say yet. The room went dead quiet. Dooley stared at him. Did you say $2, Hayes? I did. Son, the bid is 5. The bid was 5, and nobody took it, so I'm offering 2. Callum pushed off the wall and walked forward, not fast, not slow, just steady. Unless somebody wants to go higher. He looked directly at Hector Pruitt. Pruitt looked away. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the wind pushing against the saloon's front window and the creak of the floorboards under Callum's boots. $2. Dooley said slowly, like he was tasting something sour. I have $2 from Callum Hayes. Do I hear 3? He waited. The crowd shuffled, muttered, looked at their boots. Going once. Going twice. Dooley slapped his hand against the platform railing with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Sold. God help you both. Callum walked to the platform steps and stopped at the bottom. He looked up at Ara Wynne, and for the first time she looked back at him. Her eyes were gray. Not the washed-out gray of winter sky, but deep and clear, and absolutely unreadable. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds he understood that whatever she was feeling, relief, fear, suspicion, something else entirely, she had decided he was not going to see it unless she chose to show him. I have a ranch about 8 miles east, he said quietly. It needs work. So do I probably. But I'll treat you fairly, Miss Wynne. You have my word on that. She came down the steps, without taking his offered hand, not rudely, just carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who'd learned not to lean on anything until she knew it would hold. How much land? She asked. Of all the things he'd expected her to say, that wasn't one of them. Beg pardon. The ranch. How many acres? 400, give or take. She nodded once as if she was filing that away somewhere. All right, Mr. Hayes, let's go. The wagon ride out to the Double H took the better part of an hour, and they spent most of it in silence, not the uncomfortable kind Callum would think later, but the kind that happens between two people who are both doing serious thinking and have the decency to leave each other to it. The moon was up by the time they left town, big and white, and throwing long shadows across the road. The air had that sharp edge to it that late spring nights carry in Montana, cold enough to remind you winter still had opinions, warm enough to promise it wouldn't last. The advertisement, Ara said finally, after they'd cleared the last of Harrow Flat's scattered buildings. What did it say, the one you placed? Callum kept his eyes on the road. I didn't place one. She turned to look at him. He could feel it even without looking back. Then how did you? I wasn't there for the auction. I was there for fence wire. He paused, then figured honesty was the only reasonable policy given the circumstances. I stayed longer than I meant to. Another silence. Longer this time. You spent your last $2 on a woman you'd never met, she said. Not a question. More like she was reading a ledger entry and checking it twice. Yes, ma'am. Why? He thought about giving her a polished answer, something about decency, or what his mother would have said, or the way the crowd had laughed. But none of those felt like the whole truth, and she struck him as someone who'd know the difference. Because you were still standing there, he said. And nobody else was going to. Ara was quiet for a long moment. Then, that's either a very kind reason or a very foolish one. Could be both, Callum said. He thought he heard something change in her breathing, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Something in between. The ranch, she said. You said it needs work. How bad? And there it was, the question he'd been dreading. The one he'd been turning over in his mind for the past 6 months. The one he'd been lying awake with at 3 in the morning when the numbers stopped adding up, no matter how he arranged them. Bad enough, he said. Irrigation's failing on the south pasture. 2 of my fence lines need rebuilding top to bottom. The herd's down to 63 head after last winter, and I lost my hired hand to the billing silver rush back in February. I've been managing alone since. What about debts? He glanced at her then. She was watching him with that same unreadable gray gaze, calm and direct, like the question was entirely ordinary. Bank loan? He said. Coming due in 4 months. I need to show steady income or they'll call it. How much? $600. Ara turned and looked out at the dark land rolling past them, the black shapes of hills against the moon-pale sky, the occasional stand of cottonwood catching the light. She was quiet long enough that Callum started to wonder if he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation, if he'd rescued a woman from one bad situation and walked her straight into another one. I can do figures. she said finally. I kept books for my father's shipping business for 4 years before he died. I know how to find money that's hiding and cut costs that aren't earning their keep. She paused. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Hayes. I want you to know that from the start. I am not delicate. Something in Callum's chest loosened just slightly. I didn't think you were. Good. She folded her hands in her lap with a quiet precision that somehow conveyed absolute resolution. Then we have 4 months. Let's not waste any of them. The cabin hit her like a fist. Callum saw her take it in the sagging porch step, the cracked window patched with oilskin, the door that stuck in its frame because the foundation had settled, and he braced himself for something. Dismay. Anger. Tears. Ara Wynne walked inside, looked around at the single main room with its rough table and its iron stove, and its walls hung with rope and tools, and the general wreckage of a man living too hard and too alone. And she said, "Is there a broom?" Behind the stove. She found it and started sweeping, just like that, methodically starting from the far wall and working toward the door, raising dust that caught the lamplight and swirled around her like she was walking through fog. Callum stood in the doorway and watched her, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He couldn't have named it precisely. It was something adjacent to hope, but quieter, less dangerous maybe, or maybe more. He went out to tend to the horse. By the time he came back in, she'd cleared the table, swept the floor, and found his account books. 3 of them battered and water-stained, and stacked them neatly in the center of the table, with a piece of kindling laid across the top as a marker. "I'll need a candle and some paper tomorrow," she said without looking up from the book she'd already opened. "I want to go through these before I look at anything else." "You should sleep," Callum said. "I will." She turned a page. "After I understand what we're dealing with." He stood there a moment watching her bent over his accounts in the dim lamplight, this woman he'd known for approximately 3 hours, who'd sat through an auction that should have broken a person and then immediately asked about acreage, and he thought, well, this is something. "I'll take the floor," he said. "You take the bed." Ara looked up from the ledger. "I'm not taking your bed." "It's not a negotiation, Miss Wynne." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. Because you've done enough for one night, Mr. Hayes, and I am fully capable of sleeping on a wooden floor. Lord knows I've done it before." He opened his mouth. She looked back at the ledger. He took the bed. He lay there in the dark, listening to the scratch of her finger, moving across the page, the occasional soft sound of her turning a leaf, the wind against the oilskin window. And he thought about the $2 in his pocket, or rather the absence of them, because they'd gone to Dooley, and that was that. And he thought that if the next 4 months killed him outright, at least the last hour had been interesting. Oh, morning came early and hard the way it always does on a working ranch. Callum was up before dawn as usual, and he was surprised to find Ara already awake sitting at the table with 3 of his ledger books open, simultaneously a page of her own calculations beside them, and a look of focused concentration that would have stopped a charging bull. "You slept 4 hours, she said. It was sufficient. She tapped the page in front of her. "Callum, sit down. I need to show you something." He sat. She turned the ledger so he could see it. "Your water costs are wrong. You've been paying Tolliver Creek Ditch Company $6 a month for a secondary irrigation. Right? You haven't used in 2 years. That's $144 gone for nothing." She moved her finger to the next column. "And here you've been carrying this supply account at Garfield's as a fixed expense when it's actually variable. If you change how you're buying, you save roughly $40 over the next 4 months. Callum stared at the numbers. He'd gone over those books a dozen times and he'd never, "How did you—" "I told you. I kept books. It's just looking for the patterns." She sat back. "You're not as far under as you think, Callum. You've been managing badly, but you haven't been ruined. There's a difference." She paused. "Not that I'm criticizing. You've been one person doing the work of 4. You called me Callum." She stopped, looked at him. "Would you prefer Mr. Hayes?" "No," he said. "Callum's fine. I just noticed." Something moved across her face, quick and unguarded, gone before he could read it. Well, she said, we're partners, aren't we? More or less. More or less, he agreed. She pushed the ledger toward him. Then let's talk about the irrigation channels. Because that's where we lose this thing if we're not careful, and I want to walk the south pasture today before the sun gets high. He looked at her across the scarred table, this woman he'd bought for $2 in a saloon, who'd arrived with nothing but a patched dress and the kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself. And he said, "You ever been on a working ranch before, Ara?" "No," she said simply. "But I learn fast. Show me what needs doing." He did. They spent the first full day walking the property together, Callum talking and Ara listening. In that particular way, she had absolutely still eyes moving, processing everything, without interrupting, asking questions, only when he'd finished. And her questions were always the ones he hadn't thought to ask himself. The south pasture was bad. He'd known it was bad, but seeing it through her eyes, watching her crouch down and press her fingers into the cracked earth, watching her trace the line of the failed irrigation channel with her gaze, watching her calculate made it concrete in a way his own worry hadn't quite managed. "This channel needs clearing here and here," she said, standing and shading her eyes. "And you need a secondary diversion from the upper creek before the dry season. Otherwise you lose this whole section by July. That's 3 weeks of digging. 2 with both of us." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to be useful to you as an ornament, Callum. I need to be useful as a person." "Nobody said." "I know nobody said it. I'm saying it, preemptively." A beat. "I've spent enough time in situations where I wasn't allowed to be useful. I don't intend to repeat that." He wanted to ask what she meant. Something in the way she said it, the flatness of it, the careful absence of emotion told him it wasn't a story she'd chosen to tell yet. "All right," he said. "We start digging tomorrow." She nodded. And then, briefly, almost accidentally, she smiled. Just a small one, quick and a little crooked there and gone. It was the first time he'd seen it, and it hit him somewhere unexpected. He looked away at the failed irrigation channel and made himself think about water tables. 3 days and Hector Pruitt rode up to the fence line. Callum saw him coming from halfway across the north pasture and felt his mood shift the way it does when you spot weather building on the horizon. He kept working. He was restringing wire on the second gate post, but he tracked Pruitt's approach with the peripheral awareness of a man who's learned to keep one eye on certain kinds of trouble. Ara was 20 yards away, clearing debris from the irrigation ditch. She'd figured out the work in about half a day. Just watched, asked 1 or 2 precise questions, and then got into it with a focus that still surprised him. Her hands had blistered badly on the first day. She hadn't mentioned it. Pruitt reined up at the fence and looked between the two of them with the particular smile of a man who thinks he knows something other people don't. "Hayes," he said. "See you got your $2 bride settled in." Callum set down his pliers. "Pruitt, heard you been digging irrigation. Ambitious for a man who's about to lose the place anyway." "Nobody's losing anything." Pruitt's smile widened. "Bank thinks different. Word is Cole's been talking to Whitmore about buying this parcel the minute your note comes due." He nodded in Ara's direction without quite looking at her. "Might want to let your whatever she is know she may be shopping for a new arrangement come August." Callum picked up his pliers again. "You deliver that message for Cole himself, or you doing it on goodwill?" Pruitt's smile flickered. "Just being neighborly. Appreciate it. Shut the gate on your way out." Pruitt stayed where he was for a moment long enough to make a point of it, and then wheeled his horse and rode back the way he came. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Ara had stopped working. She was standing in the ditch looking at Callum across the distance between them. "Barrett Cole," she said. It wasn't a question. "He's been wanting this land for 3 years. The creek that runs through the south pasture feeds his upper range. He's let me know quietly in the way those kinds of men do that he wouldn't mind seeing me fail." "Has he done anything directly?" "Not yet." Ara climbed up out of the ditch, brushing dirt from her skirt, and walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away, her gray eyes calculating in that way that reminded him she was always running numbers even when she was doing something else. Then we don't give him the chance, she said. We move faster. Ara, I mean it. If Cole is already talking to the bank, we have less time than 4 months. We need to get the South Pasture producing, and we need documented improvements to show Whitmore before Cole can make his offer. She paused. Can you get me a meeting with Whitmore? The bank president. Yes. Callum looked at her. You want to go to the bank. I want to go to the bank, present a recovery plan, and ask for a 60-day extension on the terms, before Cole gets there. Her chin was up steady. Will Whitmore listen to a woman? I don't know, Callum said honestly. Then it's a good thing I'll have you with me. She turned back toward the irrigation ditch. Help me finish this section today. We go to town tomorrow. He watched her walk back to the ditch and drop back into it, with the efficiency of someone who'd decided that doubt was an unaffordable luxury. Callum Hayes, who had walked into a saloon for fence wire and come out with a wife or something like one, something he didn't have a word for yet, picked up his tools and went back to work. Outside, the Montana sky was doing what it does best, enormous and indifferent and blindingly blue, and somewhere on the far ridge, a hawk was riding the thermals, circling and circling patient as mathematics. The Double H Ranch had 4 months, maybe less. And for the first time in a very long time, Callum didn't feel like he was facing it alone. The bank was the kind of place that made you feel poor just by walking in. Callum had been inside Whitmore Savings and Trust maybe a dozen times in his life, and every single time he'd come out feeling like he'd left something behind, dignity mostly, and a few years off his lifespan. The ceilings were high, the floors were polished, and the man behind the glass partition had the particular expression of someone who'd spent 20 years deciding other people's fates and had stopped losing sleep over it. Clifford Whitmore was 60, gray-haired, and wore a vest that cost more than Callum's monthly feed bill. He looked up when they came in, took in Callum, and then, with the brief, evaluating pause of a man who was trying to figure out exactly what he was looking at, took in Ara. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," Callum said. That was intentional. They sat across from Whitmore's desk. Ara, with her hands folded in her lap and a leather satchel beside her that she'd asked Callum to pick up from the dry goods store the previous afternoon. She'd spent the night filling it. He hadn't asked with what. "Mr. Whitmore," she said before Callum could speak, "I'm Ara Hayes." She said it without hesitation, without apology, with the clean matter-of-factness of someone stating a geographical fact. "I've been going over the Double H accounts for the past 4 days, and I'd like to show you something." Whitmore looked at her, then at Callum, then back at her. "Mrs. Hayes," he said carefully. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "You're thinking I'm going to ask for more time and give you a hard luck story. I'm not." She opened the satchel and laid 3 pages of figures on his desk, clean, precise, organized in columns that Callum had stared at the night before, with the stunned admiration of a man watching someone do something he hadn't known was possible. "I'm going to show you a recovery plan with projected income, documented cost reductions, and a timeline for debt service that doesn't require an extension, it requires a restructure. 60 days adjusted payment schedule, and in return, you get a lien on the South Pasture irrigation improvement as additional collateral." Whitmore hadn't touched the papers. He was looking at Ara with an expression that had shifted almost against his will from condescension to something more careful. "The South Pasture is currently unproductive," he said. "It will be operational in 6 weeks, Ara said. "We've already cleared 2/3 of the main channel. I have documentation of the work completed." She produced another page. "I also have a cost analysis showing you that the Double H's current obligations are manageable if restructured, and that calling the note in August would net you less than 20 cents on the dollar given current land values. Mr. Cole's offer, whatever it is, will be below market. You know that." Dead silence. Callum held very still. He'd told her about Cole on the ride into town, and she'd listened and said nothing, and apparently had spent the intervening hours turning it into a weapon. Whitmore picked up the first page. He read it slowly. His expression did not change, which Callum had learned over the years meant he was taking something seriously. "I'll need to review these," Whitmore said finally. Of course, Ara said. We'll wait. They waited 40 minutes. Callum drank bad coffee from a tin cup a clerk brought him. Ara didn't touch hers. She sat with her back straight, and her eyes forward, and the absolute stillness of someone who has run the numbers and is confident in them, and therefore has nothing to fear from waiting. "How are you this calm?" Callum murmured. "I'm not," she said without moving. "I'm just experienced at not showing it." When Whitmore came back, he sat down and was quiet for a moment that lasted approximately 10 years. "The restructure you're proposing," he said. "The 60-day modified schedule. If you miss a payment—" "We won't," Ara said. "If you do, Mr. Whitmore." Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge like a good knife, not threatening, just precise. "I have worked with numbers my entire adult life. I do not put a figure on paper that I don't intend to stand behind. If I've told you we can meet this schedule, we can meet it. What I'm asking you to do is look at what I've given you and make a decision based on evidence, not on assumptions about what a ranch in difficulty can or cannot do." Another silence. Then Whitmore almost smiled. "Mr. Hayes," he said, looking at Callum, "you should have brought her in 6 months ago." "I didn't have her 6 months ago," Callum said. Whitmore nodded, slowly tapped the papers together, and said, "I'll have the modified agreement drawn up by end of week." Ara released a breath, so small, Callum almost didn't catch it. But he did. On the ride home, she didn't say anything for a long time. The late afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the hills, turning everything gold and amber, and the particular deep orange that only happens for about 20 minutes before it goes, and Callum drove the wagon and let her have the silence. "You did good in there," he said finally. "We needed it to work." It did work. She turned and looked at him. "Callum, Cole is going to find out about the restructure." Whitmore's clerk was listening to every word through that partition. I could see his shadow on the glass. She paused. "He'll move faster now. Whatever he was planning, he'll move it up." Callum had thought the same thing. He'd been hoping she hadn't. "Then we move faster too," he said. She turned back to face the road. "Yes," she said, "we do." And then quietly, almost to herself, "Thank you for letting me handle it." "You didn't need my permission." "No," she said, "but you gave me the room to do it without making me fight for that too. That's—" She stopped, started again. "That's not something I've always had." He didn't push. He was learning with Ara Wynn that the things she chose not to finish were often the ones that mattered most. The work in the days that followed was the hardest Callum had done since the winter that took half his herd and left him alone on the frozen ground, trying to keep the rest of them alive through 3 days of blizzard. But it was different now, and the difference was the thing he couldn't quite articulate. Not just that there were two of them, but that there was a mind working alongside him that didn't duplicate his thinking, but ran parallel to it, filling in the gaps he didn't know he had. Ara learned fast. He'd told her that on the first day, and believed it. But the reality of it still caught him off guard, the way she'd watch him do something once, and then do it herself. Not perfectly at first, but with a focused, stubborn incrementalism that meant by the third time she was better at it than he'd been after a month. The cattle were the hardest part for her. She wasn't afraid of them exactly, more like she was treating them the way she treated everything new, with careful respect and no false confidence. He watched her the morning she had to move a reluctant steer out of the south gate alone, and she was terrified he could see it in the set of her shoulders, but she didn't retreat. She stood her ground, used her voice the way he'd shown her, and the steer moved. She looked at Callum afterward like she'd just won an argument with God. "That wasn't so bad," she said, slightly breathless. "You were scared," he said. "I was." A pause. "It didn't matter." He thought about that for a long time. It was a Tuesday evening, 12 days in, when she finally told him something real. They'd been eating supper. Nothing fancy. Callum wasn't a man who cooked with ambition, but Ara had started doing something with the basics that made them considerably more edible, and the silence between them had the comfortable quality it had started to develop, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. "My father died when I was 22, she said without preamble. "He left debts I didn't know about. The business I'd been running for him, it turned out he'd borrowed against it twice." She moved a piece of potato around her plate. "There was a man. He offered to take the debts in exchange for arrangements. I said no. So he called the loans and I lost everything in about 3 weeks." Callum didn't speak. "I spent the next 2 years doing whatever work I could find. Laundress, shop counter, figured work on the side." She looked up. "When I saw the advertisement, 'Honest work Montana husband needed,' I thought that's the most transparent proposition I've been offered in 2 years. At least nobody's pretending it's something it isn't." "It wasn't supposed to be an auction," Callum said. "No," she said. "It wasn't." Her voice went flat for just a moment, and then she brought it back. "But you were there. So." He looked at her across the table. The lamplight was doing something to the angles of her face, making her look less guarded than usual. Or maybe she just was less guarded. Maybe this was what Ara Wynn looked like when she'd decided to trust something a little. "The man," Callum said carefully. "The one who called the loans. Did he didn't touch me," she said. "He didn't have to. He just removed everything. The work, the home, the money. Everything I'd built." A pause. "That's its own kind of violence, Mr. Hayes." "Callum," he said. She looked at him. "Callum." She said it like she was testing the weight of it. "For what it's worth," he said. "Nobody's going to remove anything here, not while I can stop it." Ara studied him for a moment with those clear gray eyes that he'd stopped trying to read, and started simply trusting. And then she said, "I know. That's why I told you." She picked up her fork and went back to eating, and Callum did the same, and the fire popped in the stove, and outside the Montana night was enormous and dark, and full of the sounds that land makes when it's breathing. The trouble came on a Friday, the way trouble usually does when you're tired and your guard is down, and you've just started to believe things might be going all right. Callum was at the north fence when he heard it, the low rolling sound of cattle in distress building fast, the way it does right before a stampede. He was running before the thought finished forming. He crested the ridge above the south pasture and his stomach dropped straight to the ground. 63 head of cattle were moving, not grazing, not shifting, moving with the particular mass panic energy that turns a herd into something closer to a weather event. They were heading for the creek bank, which dropped 6 feet into rock and shallow water. And if they went over the edge, he was looking at broken legs, drowning, and the end of every plan they'd made. He didn't see Ara. Then he did. She was on the east side of the herd on foot, moving parallel to the surge, with her arms out, and her voice cutting through the noise, doing exactly what he'd shown her 3 days ago, working the edge, trying to turn the lead animals. Alone, on foot, with 63 panicked cattle between her and any reasonable exit. "ARA." His voice came out like a pistol shot. "Hard left, push the lead left." She heard him. She cut hard, moving with a speed he hadn't known she had, getting ahead of the lead steer and driving into its path without flinching. Her arms wide, her voice loud and low and absolutely steady. The steer balked, tried to cut right. She was already there. The herd shifted. Not much, 15 degrees, maybe 20, but enough. The led animals curved away from the creek bank, and the ones behind followed, because that's what herds do. They follow, and the whole mass began to slow and separate and lose its terrible momentum. Callum hit the south end of the herd at a run, and worked the tail, driving and turning until the last of the cattle had slowed to an anxious mill, and the immediate crisis was over. He found Ara at the edge of the pasture, hands on her knees, breathing hard. When she straightened up, there was blood on her left hand where she'd scraped it on something. "Are you hurt?" "Scraped?" she said. "I'm fine." She looked out at the milling herd. Her jaw was tight. That wasn't natural. "No," Callum agreed. He'd already seen it, the cut fence on the west edge, clean and deliberate, and the remnants of something that had been burned near the gap. Not lightning. Not accident. Someone drove them, Ara said. Yes. She turned to look at him. Her gray eyes had gone very dark. Cole. We don't know that. Callum. Her voice was quiet and absolutely certain. We know that. He didn't argue. Because she was right, and they both knew it, and denying it out loud wouldn't change what was coming. He knows we're making progress, she said. He's not going to wait for the bank deadline anymore. He's going to try to set us back far enough that we can't recover in time. She looked at her scraped hand, then back at him. What do we do? Callum looked at the cut fence, the burned grass, the settling herd. First, he said, we fix the fence, tonight. And then we make sure he knows we saw it, and that it didn't work. He paused. There's a Ranchers Association meeting next Thursday. Every man in this valley will be there. Ara was quiet for a moment. Then, you want to go public? Cole's been playing quiet games for 3 years. He's counting on me not wanting the attention. Callum met her eyes. I'm done not wanting it. Something shifted in Ara's expression. Surprise maybe, and something deeper underneath it. Something that looked briefly like relief. All right, she said. Then we go to the meeting. She glanced toward the damaged fence. Hand me the wire cutters. I'll start on the east post. Ara, your hand. Is fine, she said. Give me the wire cutters, Callum. He gave her the wire cutters. They worked through the dusk and into the dark side by side, and by the time the fence was whole again, the stars were out in full, and Ara's hands were wrapped in the strip of cloth she'd torn from her petticoat without ceremony, and somewhere on the far side of the valley, a coyote was calling to something that wasn't answering. Callum looked at the repaired fence, then at Ara standing beside him in the dark. Tired and scraped and absolutely unbowed, and he thought this woman is going to save this ranch. And then underneath that quieter and more dangerous, this woman is going to be the end of me. He didn't say either of those things. He said, let's get inside. It's cold. Yes, she agreed. It is. They walked back to the cabin together, close enough that their arms brushed once. Neither of them moved away from it, and the Montana night closed around the Double H, like something that might, if you were careful and lucky and stubborn enough, eventually begin to feel like shelter. The Ranchers Association met in the back room of Garfield's dry goods store, which smelled like sawdust and lamp oil, and the particular brand of masculine tension that collects in any room where men have been making decisions about land and money for 30 years. Callum counted 11 ranchers when he walked in. He knew every face. Some of them he'd grown up alongside. Some had borrowed tools from his father and never returned them. Most had watched him struggle these past 2 years with the particular Montana stoicism that doesn't distinguish between respect and indifference. Every single one of them stopped talking when Ara walked in beside him. Not rudely. Just stopped. The way people stop when something happens that doesn't fit the category they've prepared for it. Callum didn't acknowledge the pause. He pulled out a chair for Ara at the long table, took the one beside her, and looked at Ed Marsh, who ran the association and had been doing so since before Callum could grow a beard. Ed, he said, appreciate you letting us attend. Marsh was a weathered, careful man who chose his words the way a good rancher chooses his breeding stock, slowly, with an eye toward what they'd produce. He looked at Ara, then at Callum. Didn't know you were bringing company. My wife has some information relevant to the valley, Callum said. Figured it belonged in front of everyone. The word wife landed in the room and redistributed the air slightly. Callum felt Ara beside him make no movement whatsoever. She was good at that, the strategic stillness. Marsh nodded once. All right, we'll get to it. They got through 20 minutes of routine business grazing rights on the upper ridge. The state of the Billings Road, a dispute about water use between the Hennessy brothers that had been ongoing since approximately the founding of the Republic. Callum waited. Ara sat with her hands folded on top of the leather satchel and said nothing, and watched everyone in the room with those clear cataloging eyes. When Marsh opened the floor, Callum stood up. 3 weeks ago, he said, someone cut my west fence line and drove my herd toward the creek bank. I lost no cattle, but not because of any kindness on their part. He paused. The week before that, Hector Pruitt rode to my fence to tell me Barrett Cole had already been talking to Whitmore about purchasing the Double H the moment my loan came due. The room went very quiet. "I'm not here to make accusations I can't support," Callum continued. "I'm here to show you something." He looked at Ara. She opened the satchel and stood, and she laid papers on the table, not dramatically, just efficiently, one after another, spreading them so the men nearest could see. "These are land acquisition records," she said. "Public filings from the county recorder's office. Over the past 4 years, Barrett Cole has purchased or forced the sale of 7 properties in this valley. 3 of them went to bank action within 60 days of documented incidents, fence-cutting water diversion herd disturbance, that were never formally attributed to anyone." Silence. "The pattern," Ara said, "is not subtle if you put the documents side by side," which apparently nobody had done before. Tom Briggs, who ran the adjacent spread to Cole's north, leaned forward. "Where'd you get these?" "County recorder's office," Ara said again. "They're public record. Anyone could have pulled them. I did." Another silence, different in texture from the first. This one had something working inside it. "Cole's not here tonight," said a man named Garvey from the far end of the table. "No," Callum said. "He's not. He's going to hear about this." "I'm counting on it," Callum said. Marsh was looking at the papers with the expression of a man who is revising something he thought he understood. He picked one up, read it, set it down. Picked up another. "The Decker place," he said quietly. "Jim Decker told me his well failed. Said it was bad luck." "His well failed 2 weeks after he refused Cole's first offer," Ara said. "It's in the timeline." The room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the slow tectonic certainty of 11 men revising their understanding of something they'd been living next to for years without seeing clearly. Marsh looked up from the papers. His eyes went to Callum, then to Ara, then back to Callum. "What do you need from us?" "Witnesses," Callum said. "If anything else happens on my property, I want men who've seen these documents and can speak to the pattern. And if Cole makes a move on anyone else in this valley, I want them to know they're not alone in it." "And the bank?" Briggs asked. "We've restructured the loan," Ara said. "We're current and will stay current." A beat. "Cole doesn't get the Double H. Not through the bank and not through sabotage. But if he decides to escalate—" She stopped. "Let that word sit." "He'll escalate," Garvey said flatly. "That's what men like Cole do when they don't get the quiet answer." "Yes," Ara agreed. "He will." Cole escalated on a Wednesday. Callum was in the barn when he heard horses, more than one, moving with purpose. He came out to find 3 riders at the edge of his yard, and in the center of the 3 Barrett Cole himself. Cole was a big man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago, and had since settled into something harder. He wore his money in the details. Good boots, silver conchos on his belt, a horse worth more than Callum's monthly payroll. He looked at the yard with the calm of a man who had already decided how this conversation was going to go. "Hayes," he said. "Heard you been busy." "Cole." Callum didn't move from the barn doorway. "Long ride for a social call." "Not social." Cole's eyes moved to the cabin, then back. "Heard your wife's been making noise at the association, showing papers around." "Public records," Callum said. "Nothing on those pages that wasn't already filed. What those pages were was a provocation." Cole's voice stayed even, which was somehow worse than anger. "I've been patient with you, Hayes. 3 years patient. Your father was a stubborn man, and you're more stubborn. But there's a point where stubbornness stops being a virtue and starts being a liability." "Is that a threat?" "It's an observation." Cole shifted in the saddle. "I'll give you fair market on the property. More than fair, I'll give you what you owe the bank plus 10%. You walk away clean, no debt, no struggle. Your wife gets a fresh start somewhere that isn't a losing fight." Callum was quiet for a moment. He was aware without turning around that Ara had come out of the cabin and was standing on the porch. He didn't look back at her. "This isn't a losing fight," he said. "Not yet," Cole said. "But I'm a patient man, Hayes, and this valley has a way of adjusting to reality, sooner or later." "Cole." Callum's voice went flat and quiet. "You drove my cattle toward that creek bank. You've been working men in this valley for years with the same playbook and thinking nobody was keeping score. Somebody's keeping score now." He paused. "Go home." For a moment, Cole just looked at him, the particular look of a man recalculating. Then he turned his horse and left his two riders falling in behind, and the sound of hooves faded down the road, and the silence that followed had a specific weight to it. Not relief, but the held breath feeling of a storm that has moved off without breaking. Callum turned around. Ara was standing on the porch with her arms crossed and her jaw set. She'd heard everything. "He's not done," she said. "No." "What did you mean somebody's keeping score?" Callum walked toward the porch. "I've been documenting everything since the fence cutting. Dates, descriptions, what I found and where. Marsh agreed to countersign as a witness to the association presentation." Ara stared at him. "You didn't tell me that." "I was going to. When it became relevant." He stopped at the porch steps. "It's relevant now." She looked at him for a long measuring moment. Then, "What else haven't you told me that's relevant?" He thought about it honestly. "I wrote to the county sheriff 3 days ago. Sent him a copy of the records you pulled and my incident documentation. Asked him to open an inquiry." Ara's eyes went wide just briefly, just enough. "Callum. If Cole escalates physically, I want it on record that we'd already reported a pattern. Means it's not a dispute between neighbors. It's evidence of a campaign." She was quiet, processing. He could see it happening, the quick internal movement of a mind running variables. "The sheriff," she said. "Will he act?" "Sheriff Alderman's an honest man. He won't move fast, but he'll move. And in the meantime, Cole knows we went to the association, and now he's going to assume we went to the sheriff too." She stopped. Her expression changed. "He's going to do something before Alderman can respond." "Probably. Soon." "Yes." Ara came down the porch steps and stood in front of him very close, looking up at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, not the calculated steadiness she wore like armor, but something raw underneath it. Something that looked like fear that had decided to turn itself into resolve instead. "Then we need to be ready," she said. "Yes," Callum said. "We do." He was looking down at her and she was looking up at him, and the distance between them was about 8 inches, and neither of them did anything about it. But both of them knew that something had just changed, not loudly, not dramatically, the way important things rarely do. "Come inside," Ara said. "We need to talk about what ready looks like." They stayed up half the night. Ara had a plan. Of course she did. She always had a plan. Callum had stopped being surprised by this and started being grateful for it, and it involved 3 things. Accelerating the irrigation work so the south pasture could be documented as operational before Cole could manufacture another setback. Getting Tom Briggs and Ed Marsh to ride the fence line with Callum once a week as standing witnesses, and preparing a formal affidavit documenting every incident since the night of the auction. "The affidavit goes to Whitmore as well as Alderman," she said. "I want the bank to understand that any failure on our part would be manufactured failure. That changes their calculus." "You think of everything," Callum said. It came out more sincerely than he intended. Ara looked at him across the table. In the lamplight, with her hair coming loose from its pins, and tiredness around her eyes, and that particular focused intensity that never quite left her face, she looked not soft exactly, but less armored than usual. Like she'd stopped holding something. "I don't think of everything," she said. "You think of the things I don't. The association meeting was your idea. The sheriff letter was yours. You know these people and this land in ways I never will." She paused. "We're better together than either of us is alone. That's just arithmetic." "Arithmetic," he said. "Don't make it sentimental," she said, but there was something at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not. Wouldn't dream of it, Callum said. She went back to the affidavit. He watched her write for a moment, her hand moving quickly, precisely, the scratch of the pen, the only sound in the cabin, and he thought about a thing he'd been carefully not thinking for the past 3 weeks, which was that at some point, the practicality of this arrangement was going to become insufficient as a description of what it actually was. He got up and put more wood in the stove and went to bed before that thought could finish itself. The south pasture irrigation was operational on a Thursday morning, 41 days after Ara had looked at the cracked earth of that section and said 2 weeks with both of us. It had taken longer than she'd projected because Cole's fence cutting had cost them 4 days and the replacement wire had been back-ordered, and they'd had to reroute a section of channel around a rock shelf that hadn't shown up in Callum's rough survey. But it was done, and it worked, and when the water ran through the new channel and spread across the dry ground of the south pasture for the first time in 2 years, Callum stood and watched it with a feeling he wasn't sure he could name. Ara stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Your projections said 6 weeks," he said finally. "My projections said 6 weeks under optimal conditions." A pause. "Nothing about this has been optimal conditions." "No," he agreed. "But here we are." She turned and looked at him. The morning light was doing something to her face, catching it straight on, full and clear, and he saw what he'd been learning in pieces these past 6 weeks. That Ara Wynne was not merely competent, or merely brave, or merely smart, but all three at once, and in combination. And that the woman who'd stood on that auction platform with her eyes down had not been broken, had never been broken, had simply been waiting for ground solid enough to stand on. "Here we are," she said. And then it happened. The thing that had been accumulating for 6 weeks of shared work and shared meals and shared fear. The thing he'd been carefully not thinking about, the thing she'd called arithmetic. He kissed her, or she kissed him. Afterward, he was honestly not sure who moved first, and it didn't seem like a question that needed an answer. It was brief, just a moment, just a point of contact, warm and quiet. And when they separated, she looked at him with those gray eyes gone wide, and then immediately, instinctively looked away. "That was..." she started. "Yes," he said. "I wasn't..." "Neither was I." A long pause. A very long pause. "The pasture still needs fencing on the north edge," she said. "It does," he agreed. "We should do that today." "We should." They walked back toward the barn together, not quite touching the morning large and bright around them. And Callum Hayes thought, 4 months ago, I had $2 and a failing ranch, and I walked into a saloon for fence wire. He thought about how much distance a person could travel in 41 days if they had the right partner walking alongside them. He didn't say any of that. He got the fencing tools and handed Ara her pair of gloves, the good ones, the ones he'd bought her at Garfield's after her hands had blistered past the point of stoic management, and she pulled them on without comment, and they went to work. The south pasture breathed its new water into the dry Montana air around them, and somewhere down the valley, Barrett Cole was still sitting on his plans, and Sheriff Alderman was sitting on his inquiry, and the bank was sitting on its restructure. And all of it was coming, the good and the bad, both the way it always does in a life that's actually being lived. But that Thursday morning, in the new light, with the water running, and the work still ahead of them, and something warm and unnamed sitting between them, like a coal in a campfire, small, carefully tended, capable of becoming something much larger, Callum decided to let himself believe they were going to make it. Sheriff Alderman rode out to the Double H on a Friday morning, and he didn't come alone. He brought a deputy, and more surprisingly, a man Callum didn't recognize, city clothes, leather satchel, the careful posture of someone who writes things down for a living. Alderman introduced him as a surveyor from the county land office, and something about the way he said it, flat, deliberate, watching Callum's face for a reaction, told Callum this visit was more than a courtesy call. Ara came out of the cabin before Callum could call for her. She had flour on her hands from the bread she'd been making, and she wiped them on her apron without ceremony and looked at the 3 men on horseback with the same expression she gave ledger columns that weren't adding up correctly. "Sheriff," she said, "you'd better come in." They sat around the table, all five of them crowded in the small cabin. Ara at one end with her hands folded and Callum at the other, Alderman in between with his hat on his knee and his deputy standing by the door, and the surveyor man opening his satchel with the focused quiet of someone who does not waste words. "I got your letter," Alderman said to Callum, "and the documents your wife pulled from the recorder's office." "And," Callum said, "and I did some pulling of my own." Alderman glanced at the surveyor, who produced a folded paper and laid it on the table. "That's a water rights survey from 1869, 4 years before coal started buying in this valley." He tapped the paper. "The creek that runs through your south pasture, the one Cole's been trying to get his hands on for 3 years, it's not just an amenity. Under the original Territorial Water Compact, whoever holds the downstream rights on that creek controls the allocation for 4 surrounding properties, including Cole's upper range." Silence. Callum looked at Ara. Ara was looking at the survey with an expression of rapidly accelerating comprehension. "He doesn't just want the land," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am," Alderman said. "He wants the water rights. The land's just how you hold them." Ara sat back slowly. "That's why he's been so persistent. That's why 3 years it wasn't about the acreage or the cattle or any of it. It was always about the creek." "That would be my read," Alderman said. "Does Cole know we know this?" Callum asked. "He will by end of day. Word travels." Alderman folded his hands on the table. "Now, I want to talk to you about what happened to your fence line, and I want to talk to you about Jim Decker's well, and I want to talk to you about 3 other incidents in this valley that I'm now looking at differently than I was 2 weeks ago. And I need your affidavit, Mrs. Hayes. The full one." Ara stood, went to the shelf where she kept the ranch's important papers, and produced the affidavit without a word. 6 pages clean and precise, dated and signed. Alderman looked at it for a long moment. "You had this ready?" "I expected you'd come eventually," Ara said. "I wanted to be prepared when you did." The sheriff looked at her, the way Whitmore had looked at her, with that same recalibrating expression, that slight adjustment of prior assumptions. "How long did this take you to write?" "2 evenings," she said. "The documentation took longer. The writing was straightforward." She paused. "It's just telling the truth in the right order." Alderman left with the affidavit, the survey copy, and the Ranchers Association testimony that Ed Marsh had signed and delivered the previous week. He told them he'd be in touch. He told them to document everything and to send word immediately if there were further incidents. What he didn't tell them, what Callum understood from the careful way the sheriff chose his words, was exactly how much time they had before Cole figured out the game had changed and decided to burn the board. As it turned out, they had 48 hours. The fire started at 2 in the morning. Callum smelled it before he heard it, that particular sharp wrongness that cuts through sleep like a blade and gets you vertical before your brain has finished waking up. He was out of bed and to the window in 3 seconds, and what he saw was the north hay barn lit orange against the black sky, fire moving fast up the dry wood of the east wall. He hit the floor running. "Ara!" He was already pulling on his boots, grabbing his coat. "Ara, get up. Fire in the north barn." She was up before he finished the sentence. No fumbling, no disorientation, just immediate total alertness, and he would think about that later, about what kind of life produces that kind of reflexes in a person. "The cattle," she said, already moving. "North barn's hay and equipment, no cattle in it. But if it spreads to the south fence..." He didn't finish that sentence. He didn't have to. They hit the yard running. The north barn was past saving. He knew it the moment he came around the corner and felt the heat. The whole east wall was gone, and the roof was starting to go, and there was nothing to do about the barn itself. What mattered was containment. What mattered was the south fence line 40 yards away, and the dry grass between here and there, and the wind that had come up from the northwest and was pushing the fire exactly the wrong direction. "The water trough," Ara said. "And the well bucket. We need to wet the grass between here and the fence." "It's not enough water." "Then we wet what we can, and we beat the rest." She was already moving, and Callum moved with her, and for the next hour they did not think and they did not feel, they just worked. Hauling water, wetting down the ground, beating at the grass fire that kept trying to creep south with wet burlap sacks they'd soaked in the trough. It was brutal work, hot and choking, and twice Callum had to pull Ara back from a section that was advancing too fast. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, he heard horses. He straightened up, half blinded by smoke, and saw lanterns coming down the road from the north. Not one or two. 6, 8 more riders and wagons moving fast, the particular organized urgency of people who have seen fire before and know what it means. Ed Marsh was in the lead. Behind him came Tom Briggs and 2 of the Hennessy brothers, and Garvey, and 4 more men Callum recognized from the association meeting. "Saw the light from the ridge," Marsh said, already dismounting. "What do you need?" Callum's throat was so raw he could barely get the words out. "South fence line. Keep it from jumping." They kept it from jumping. By the time the north barn was nothing but a glowing skeleton, and the ground between it and the south fence was thoroughly soaked, and the immediate danger was past. There were 11 men and 2 women in Callum's yard, and someone had produced coffee from somewhere, and the sky was beginning to go gray in the east. Callum sat on the well housing with his elbows on his knees and his hands hanging, and he was so tired he couldn't feel his legs properly. Ara sat beside him close enough that their shoulders were touching, and she smelled like smoke, and her hair had come entirely down, and there was a burn on her left forearm. She hadn't mentioned, and wasn't going to mention, unless he noticed it, which he had. "Your arm," he said. "It's minor." "Let me see it." She let him see it. He wrapped it with the strip of cloth she'd used on her hand 3 weeks ago, which she'd apparently kept folded in her apron pocket, because of course she had, and she held still while he did it and looked at the smoking ruins of the north barn with an expression he couldn't read. "He escalated," she said. "Yes." "He thought this would break us." "Yes." She turned and looked at him. Her face in the early gray light was smudged with smoke and stripped of all its usual careful composure, and what was underneath was not broken. The opposite of broken. Something tempered something that had been through heat and come out harder. "It didn't?" she said. "No." Callum agreed. "It didn't." Marsh appeared in front of them, cup of coffee in each hand, and held them out without a word. They took them. "I sent my boy for alderman before we rode over," Marsh said. "He'll be here by morning." Callum looked at him. "You assumed it was Cole." "Didn't assume anything," Marsh said. "Just figured the sheriff ought to know about a fire at the Hayes place given the current circumstances." He paused. "Also figured if it was an accident, no harm done. And if it wasn't..." He looked at the smoking barn and back at Callum. "Well, a man who burns his neighbor's barn in the middle of the night has made a particular kind of statement about what kind of man he is." "He has," Callum said. Marsh looked at Ara. "You put together a fine affidavit, Mrs. Hayes. Passed it around the association. Every man who read it is standing in your yard right now." Ara looked out at the group of men moving around the yard, checking the fence line, making sure no embers had jumped the quiet, competent work of people who know land and know what fire can do. Her jaw moved. Just once, just a small compression, the closest she ever came to losing her composure in front of people. "Tell them thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. "Tell them I'll remember it." "Tell them yourself," Marsh said. "They'd appreciate hearing it from you directly." He walked back to the group, and Callum watched Ara watch him go. "You're going to cry," he said very quietly. "I absolutely am not," she said equally quietly, in the voice of someone who is in fact considering it. "It's all right if you do. I know it's all right. I'm choosing not to." She picked up her coffee cup. "There's too much to do." Alderman arrived at 7 in the morning and spent 2 hours walking the property, taking measurements, interviewing the men who'd seen the fire. He collected 3 burn samples from the base of the east wall, and he was quiet about what they told him, but Callum could read it in the set of his jaw. Accelerant. The kind of quiet confirmation that changes a fire from a disaster into a crime. I'm going to Cole's place, Alderman said when he was done. He said it without emphasis, the way you state a next step that's already decided. I want both of you to stay here. Don't go anywhere near Cole or his property. Don't send word. Don't do anything. He looked at Callum directly. This is the part where you let the law handle it, Hayes. I know that's hard for a man to hear when somebody's burned his barn, but you've done everything right up to now. Don't hand him away to muddy the water at the end. What about the water rights? Ara said. Alderman turned to her. What about them? If Cole is removed from the situation, arrested, charged, whatever happens, there will be a period of legal uncertainty. His land, his contracts, everything under review. The water compact rights he's been trying to acquire through our property will be contested. She paused. I want to file a formal claim on the downstream allocation before that window closes. Today, if possible. Alderman looked at her for a moment. You want to file the claim today? The surveyor who came with you on Friday, he already had the documents. He knows the compact. If I can get to the county recorder's office before Cole's situation becomes public. Ara, Callum said. Not stopping her, just checking. If we hold the water rights, Cole has no leverage, she said. Not now, not from a jail cell, not ever. Without the downstream allocation, his upper range is dependent on goodwill and weather. He cannot pressure us or anyone else in this valley from that position. She looked at Alderman. Is there a legal reason I cannot file today? No, Alderman said slowly. There isn't. Then I'd like to borrow a horse, she said, and I'd like Ed Marsh to ride with me as a witness, and I would like to go to the county recorder's office and file a water rights claim before noon. The sheriff looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man who is genuinely uncertain whether he is impressed or alarmed, and has decided it doesn't matter. Marsh, he called without looking away from Ara. Marsh came over. Yeah, ride to town with Mrs. Hayes, county recorder. A pause. Don't let her do anything illegal. I don't intend to do anything illegal, Ara said. I know, Alderman said. That's the part that impresses me. 2. She filed the claim at 11:47 in the morning. The clerk at the recorder's office, a young man named Foster, who clearly had not been expecting this particular combination of a soot-smudged woman with a burned arm and a formidable grasp of territorial water law on a Friday morning, spent 20 minutes verifying that everything was in order, and then stamped the document with the expression of someone who has decided the wisest course is to simply process what's in front of him and not ask questions. Ara walked out of the recorder's office with a copy of the claim folded in her satchel and her chin up, and she stood on the board sidewalk for a moment in the morning light. And Marsh, who'd been watching the whole thing with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has correctly identified which way the river is running, stood beside her and said nothing. Then she turned and said, Ed, did any of the ranchers in this valley lose water access because of Cole's acquisitions? Marsh thought about it. Hennessy Brothers might have. Cole bought the Garber place 2 years back, and there's a tributary that... I want to talk to them, Ara said. When this is settled, there may be a compact reorganization that benefits everyone downstream. She paused. A water-sharing agreement. Legal, formal, documented. The kind that makes it harder for any one person to do what Cole's been doing. Marsh looked at her. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since the sheriff showed us the survey, she said. The problem was never just Cole. The problem is a system where one man can control water access and use it as a weapon. Fix the system, you fix the problem. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your husband, no, he married a general. Something passed across Ara's face, warm and complicated and private. It's a complicated arrangement. Ma'am, Marsh said with the gentleness of a man who's watched a lot of life. I've known Callum Hayes since he was 12 years old. I've never seen that man look at anything the way he looks at you. He paused. Just an observation, from an old rancher who should probably mind his own business. Ara looked at the street for a moment. Let's go back, she said. He'll be worried. Callum was worried. He'd spent the morning helping the remaining men clear debris from the barn site and thinking about things he should probably stop thinking about. Specifically the moment 2 weeks ago by the irrigation channel, and the way it had been quietly changing the chemistry of every interaction since then. The small adjustments, the new awareness, the way he'd started noticing the specific sounds of her moving through the cabin in the morning, and found himself unwilling to call that information ordinary. He heard the horses and was out of the barn before he consciously decided to move. Ara dismounted, and he was there, and she looked at him with the particular directness she used when she'd made a decision. He'd learned to recognize it, that specific quality of resolution in her gray eyes. "The claim is filed," she said. "Good." He looked at her arm, at the bandage he'd put on in the yard that morning. "You're all right." "I'm all right." She handed Marsh the reins without looking away from Callum. "The sheriff. At Cole's place. No word yet." She nodded, stepped a little closer. "Callum. I've been thinking." She stopped, started again. "About the arrangement." He waited. "It's not, I don't think complicated is the right word anymore," she said. "For what this is." She said it carefully, like she was testing the weight of it, the way she'd said his name that first night. "I think what it is real. If that's—" She stopped again. He reached out and took her unwrapped hand, the right one, carefully, and held it. "It's real," he said. The relief that moved across her face was so swift and unguarded that it hit him somewhere deep, because he understood what it cost her to show it, what it cost a woman who'd had everything taken once to let herself want something again. "Good," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hand held his back firm and certain. "Then we're agreed." "We're agreed," he said. Behind them, Ed Marsh quietly took his horse to the water trough and found something else to look at. Inside the cabin, the fire in the stove was burning low, and the affidavit copies were stacked neatly on the shelf, and the $2 silver, the ones Callum had taken from Dooley's hands the night of the auction, and kept without entirely knowing why in the tin box with his other valuables, sat where they'd always sat. Outside, somewhere down the valley, a rider was moving fast, word from Alderman, and everything that had been building for 4 months, the work, the fear, the water rights, the burned barn, the affidavit, the association, the kiss by the irrigation channel that neither of them had mentioned since, was about to come to a head. Callum saw the rider, and his hand tightened on Ara's just once. She felt it, and turned, and saw the rider too, and she didn't pull away. She stood beside him, her hand in his, and they waited together for whatever was coming. The rider was Alderman's deputy, a young man named Creel, who rode like he was being chased and pulled up in Callum's yard, with the horse still moving. "Sheriff says come to town," Creel said, breathing hard. "Both of you. Now." "Cole," Callum said. "Sheriff's got him at the jail, but there's a complication." Creel looked between them. "Cole's lawyer got there before we did. Man named Pruitt, not Hector, his brother from Billings. He's already filing a counterclaim, saying the barn fire was an accident, and the water rights claim Mrs. Hayes filed this morning is fraudulent." Ara's hand was still in Callum's. He felt it go very still. "Fraudulent on what grounds?" she said. "Says you filed under a false name. Says the marriage isn't legal." Creel had the decency to look uncomfortable delivering it. "Says you were purchased at an auction, and there was no proper ceremony, and therefore you have no standing as Mrs. Hayes and no right to file on behalf of the property." The yard went absolutely quiet. Callum looked at Ara. Ara was looking at Creel with an expression that gave nothing away. That perfect practiced stillness, but her hand in his, had tightened to the point where he could feel every individual bone in it. "He's saying the water claim is void," she said flatly. "His lawyer is saying it, yes ma'am." "And the arson evidence?" "Sheriff's got it. Burn samples, witness statements, the works. But Cole's lawyer is saying it's circumstantial, and he'll have Cole out by Monday unless—" Creel stopped. "Unless what?" Callum said. "Unless the complaint is filed by a party with legal standing. And right now Cole's lawyer is arguing there's no such party. That the Double H has one owner of record, and that owner—" He looked at Callum apologetic. "He's saying you bought a woman at an auction, Hayes, not a wife. His words, not mine." Callum let go of Ara's hand. Not because he wanted to, he watched her register the loss of contact and watched her immediately rebuild her composure around it, the way she always did, that instant self-containment that broke his heart a little every time he saw it. "Saddle the horses," he said to Creel. "We'll be ready in 5 minutes." Creel went to the barn. Callum turned to Ara. She was already thinking he could see it, that rapid internal movement, the variables running. But underneath it, for just a moment, something else, a look he recognized from the auction platform, from the first night in the cabin, from every moment when the world had reminded her that her footing was not as solid as she'd worked to make it. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. "He's not wrong," Callum said. "About the ceremony. We don't have one." "I know. So let's fix that." She stared at him. "Callum, I'm not asking you to do something you don't want. I'm asking you to tell me the truth about what you want." He held her gaze. "Because what I want is not complicated. What I want is for you to have every legal right to this land and this life that I have. And I want it because—" He stopped, made himself say the rest. "Because this stopped being a practical arrangement about 6 weeks ago, and we've both been too busy to say so out loud." Ara looked at him for a long moment. The careful gray eyes, the face that had learned not to show things until it was safe. And then something in it opened, not dramatically, not with tears or declarations, just a quiet fundamental shift, like a window coming unlatched. "There's no time for a ceremony," she said. "We have to get to town." "Reverend Callis lives 2 miles from here," Callum said. "On the way to town." A pause, a very long pause. "That would be extremely fast," she said. "Yes, it would. People would talk. People are already talking." Another pause. Then that small, crooked, briefly appearing smile, the one he'd been cataloging for 6 weeks, like a man who knows he's collecting something precious. "Well," she said, "get the horses." Reverend Callis was eating breakfast when they knocked on his door, and to his eternal credit, he asked only 2 questions. Were they of sound mind, and were they doing this freely? They said yes to both, and he married them in his front room in 11 minutes with his wife as witness and the coffee going cold on his table. And when it was done, he shook Callum's hand and looked at Ara with the particular expression of a man who has performed many ceremonies and can usually tell which ones will hold. "God keep you both," he said. "Now go do what you need to do." They went. Cole. The sheriff's office was standing room only by the time they got there. Cole sat in the single chair beside Alderman's desk, with his lawyer beside him. Pruitt, a thin city man with careful hands, who radiated the specific confidence of someone who has won arguments by making them too complicated to follow. 3 of Cole's ranch hands stood near the door. Marsh and Briggs were there, and Garvey and 2 men Callum didn't recognize, who Alderman introduced quietly as a territorial land inspector, and a deputy attorney general who'd ridden in from Helena that morning. That stopped Callum cold. "Helena. Sent for him 3 days ago," Alderman said low. "After I saw the water rights survey and your wife's affidavit. This stopped being a local matter the moment I understood what Cole's been doing across the valley." He looked at Ara. "Filed the claim this morning." 11:47, Ara said. "I have the stamped copy." Pruitt, the lawyer, was already standing. "Sheriff, I've made clear that the claim filed this morning is legal," said the Deputy Attorney General, whose name was Carver, and who had the blunt, economical manner of a man who has no time for theater. He was holding a copy of something Ara's affidavit. Callum realized. He'd been reading it. "The compact claim is legal. I've reviewed the filing. The water rights under the 1869 Territorial Compact are properly documented, and the application is in order." He looked at Pruitt without warmth. "Your challenge to Mrs. Hayes's standing is also moot, counselor. I have a marriage certificate dated this morning, witnessed and signed." Cole turned and looked at Callum for the first time since they'd walked in. The big man's face was very controlled, but something was moving behind his eyes, a recalculation fast and not pleasant. "This morning," Cole said. "This morning," Callum said. Cole looked at Ara. She met his gaze with the full composure of a woman who has already won the argument and is simply waiting for the other party to understand it. "You planned this," Cole said. "Not to Callum, to Ara." "I planned the water rights claim," she said evenly. "The marriage was Callum's idea, though I'll admit the timing was fortunate." Pruitt tried twice more, once with a procedural challenge, and once with a creative interpretation of the compact language that Carver dispatched in about 30 seconds, and then he sat down and didn't get up again. Alderman turned to Cole and said in the tone of a man who has been waiting to say something for quite a while, "Barrett, I've got burn samples from the Hayes barn that show accelerant consistent with lamp oil in a pattern that does not occur in accidental fires. I've got 3 witnesses who saw riders near the Hayes property the night of the fire. I've got a 6-year timeline of incidents in this valley that shows a pattern of harassment coordinated with your property acquisition attempts." He paused. "And I've got a deputy attorney general sitting in my office." Cole's jaw was tight. He was looking at the table. "You want to talk to me?" Alderman said. "Or do you want to talk to him?" Cole talked. Not that morning his lawyer stopped that, but by Monday he was talking, and what he said was enough. Enough for Alderman to close the inquiry on the Decker well. Enough for the Territorial Land Office to open a formal review of 3 of Cole's acquisitions. Enough for the bank. Whitmore, who received a copy of Carver's preliminary findings by messenger on Saturday afternoon, to quietly let it be known that the Double H loan restructure was fully supported, and that no further discussion of that property's disposition would be entertained from any third party. Enough finally for Jim Decker, who'd sold his place 2 years ago, believing his bad luck was just that, to file a recovery claim with the Territorial Office. None of it happened fast. That was the part nobody told you about justice, not in 1873. Not anywhere that it moved like water through rock, slow and patient and grinding. Cole's full legal accounting would take the better part of a year. The acquisition reviews would take longer. The Valley would be talking about it for a decade. But the Double H was safe. That happened fast enough. On the first day of August, they made the loan payment on time. Callum drove to town and sat across from Whitmore and put the cash on the desk, earned money, real money, from 63 head of cattle that had come through the summer on south pasture grass, irrigated by a channel that 2 people had dug with their own hands in 41 days. Whitmore counted it, wrote the receipt, slid it across the desk. "Mr. Hayes," he said, and then seemed to feel that was insufficient. "Tell your wife, tell Mrs. Hayes that the bank appreciates her thoroughness." "I'll tell her," Callum said. He was almost to the door when Whitmore said, "Hayes." He turned. "Cole's lawyer approached me in April," Whitmore said. "About the note. Made a preemptive offer." He paused. "I want you to know I didn't seriously consider it." Callum looked at him. "Did you tell Cole that—" A pause. "Not as directly as I might have." "No," Callum said. "I didn't think so." He walked out into the August sun and stood on the board sidewalk and breathed the warm air of a town that had been slowly rearranging its understanding of Barrett Cole for the past 3 weeks. And he thought about Ara's voice in Whitmore's office that first morning, calm and precise and utterly without apology. And he thought about what it costs a person to be that calm when everything is on the line. And he decided he was going to spend a considerable amount of time for the rest of his life making sure she didn't have to carry that alone. He went home. Ara was at the table when he got back. Account books open a habit she'd never entirely dropped, the way a good navigator keeps checking the stars, even when they know where they are. She looked up when he came in, and he held up the receipt, and she crossed the room in 4 steps and took it from his hands and read every word of it with the focused intensity she gave everything. And then she set it very carefully on the table. "We did it," she said. "We did it." He agreed. She turned and looked at him, and he saw it again, that open, unlatched thing in her face. the one that had been appearing more frequently in the past weeks, less guarded each time. She was learning, he thought. Learning that the ground was solid, that it would hold. "I want to build the new barn before winter," she said. "I've already drawn plans. The footprint is bigger than the old one we'll need it if we're expanding the herd, which we should do in spring." "We," he said. She looked at him. "Is that—" "Yes," he said. "It's exactly right." She smiled, not the small, careful, briefly appearing one he'd been cataloging, but a full one, wide and unheld, and transforming her face entirely, and it hit him the way it always did when she let something real show through, which was like walking into warm light after a long time in the cold. He crossed to her, and she met him in the middle of the room. No preamble, no negotiation. Just the straightforward fact of two people who have decided, and he held her, and she held him back with the same no-nonsense completeness she brought to everything. Her face against his shoulder, his arms around her. The receipt for a paid debt sitting on the table, and outside the Montana summer going about its enormous, indifferent, beautiful business. "The barn plans," he said into her hair. Can they wait until tomorrow?" She pulled back just enough to look at him. Those gray eyes clear and present, and fully, finally unguarded. "The plans can wait," she said. "Yes." They built the barn in September with help from Marsh and Briggs and the Hennessy brothers, who showed up on a Saturday morning with tools and food and no particular need for an invitation. The water-sharing compact Ara had proposed was signed by 6 Valley ranchers before the first frost, witnessed by the county recorder and filed in duplicate, and the land inspector from Helena told Callum quietly that it was the most sensible piece of range management documentation he'd seen in 20 years of territorial work. Jim Decker got a portion of his land back in the spring. Not all of it. The legal machinery of recovery is slow and partial, but enough to start again. And he started again. Cole's trial concluded the following April. He was convicted of arson and property fraud and served 3 years. When he came out, the valley had reorganized itself around his absence and had no particular use for his return. The Double H grew. Slowly at first, then with the steady momentum of a thing that has been properly rooted. Callum expanded the herd to 120 head by the spring following the fire. Ara's accounts were meticulous and profitable, and occasionally reviewed by Whitmore himself, who had developed a professional respect for her methods that he expressed in the only way men like him knew how, by extending favorable terms without being asked. In 1875, their daughter was born. They named her Clara after nobody in particular, and after something in the sound of it that both of them liked, without being able to say why. She had Ara's gray eyes and Callum's stubbornness, which Ara said was redundant, and Callum said was thorough. In 1877, a son, Thomas. He had his father's hands and his mother's way of looking at a problem that still cataloging attention, that saw patterns where other people saw noise. The 2 silver dollars sat in the tin box on the shelf for all of it. Callum had told Ara about them early on, how he'd gotten them back from Dooley the night of the auction, how he'd kept them without knowing exactly why. She'd held them in her palm and looked at them for a long moment, and then set them back in the tin carefully, like they were something that needed keeping. $2, she said. $2, he agreed. That's what I was worth to the room, she said. Not bitterly, just precisely in the way she said things that were true and needed to be said clearly before you could set them down properly. To the room, Callum said. Yes. She'd looked at him then. And to you. He'd thought about everything he could say, all the things that had accumulated in the months since that night, the work and the fear and the irrigation channel and the fire and the 11 minutes in Reverend Callis's front room and the receipt on the table and the full unheld smile. And he said the only thing that was actually sufficient, everything he said, from the first minute. Ara had held his gaze for a moment, and then she'd closed the tin and put it back on the shelf. And that was that. The thing named the thing settled the way she preferred. Her important things stated clearly, filed correctly, and then acted upon without further ceremony. They told the story to Clara first, when she was old enough to ask where things had started. Clara asked what had happened to the $2, and Ara took down the tin and showed her, and Clara held them the way children hold things they understand are significant carefully, with both hands. "Why did he bid if he only had $2? Clara asked. Ara looked across the room at Callum, who was watching from the doorway, with the quiet expression that was simply his face now when he looked at her present, certain at rest. "Because somebody had to," Ara said. Clara thought about this with the focused attention of her mother's eyes and her father's patience. But what if it hadn't worked out? Callum pushed off the doorframe and came into the room and sat down across from his daughter and his wife in the cabin that was larger now and warmer and entirely unmistakably home. "It worked out," he said simply, and it had. Against the auction block and the drought and the sabotage and the fire and the lawyers and the fear and all the accumulated weight of two lives that had been pushed hard before they found each other. It had worked out completely the way things sometimes do, when two people are stubborn enough and honest enough and willing enough to bet everything on a partner they've chosen to believe in. The Double H stood. The water ran clean through the south pasture. The new barn held through every winter after. And the $2 silver stayed in the tin on the shelf year after year, catching the light sometimes, when the cabinet door swung open, small and tarnished, and absolutely irreplaceable. The proof that the most important things in a life can begin with the simplest act of one person deciding that another person is worth standing up for. That was how it started. That was how it lasted. And in Harrow Flats, Montana, in the long memory of a valley that had seen both the best and worst of what people can do to each other, that was how Callum Hayes and Ara Wynne, who had come to each other with nothing but $2 and a willingness to try, built something that neither drought nor greed nor fire could take away. They built a life, and it held.